let's consider the matter of individual artistic agenda. Whether an artist has formalized this in terms of setting goals, writing them down, working to achieve them over time, or whether it's just simply working personally in a particular direction. The nature of the artistic agenda will help define the relationship of the artist to society and eventually affect or shape the work and the way it's created. Here's something for your consideration. It's simply a question. What are the personal and emotional characteristics of artists that would lead to an individual artistic agenda? So, specifically, what is artistic agenda? Is it motivation? Is it a personal vision? Is it drive? It's all those things, but it's something more. It's the thing that carries the artist. It's the thing that motivates the artist and helps them to make connections with their audience. It's the reason why artists create. And like a compass, it can also help an artist find true north when times are tough. That's very important. The art world is a good place. It can be a very generous place, but it can also be a very unforgiving place at times. And without an agenda, without a personal roadmap of some time, sometimes artists will flounder and lose vision of what they're trying to achieve. There was a movie called Rent that was based on a stage play that came from an opera about 100 years ago by Puccini called La Bohème. And in Rent, there are several artists in different disciplines. There's musicians, there's actors, dancers, but there's a filmmaker. And we see him throughout the entire movie. He makes films using an old wind-up camera, which is very interesting because we're working and living in a day and an age of technology and digital media. And here we have someone who is using a camera, because this is all he can afford, that he got at probably some photography shop many years ago. And he's using celluloid film that's very hard to obtain. But yet this is what he can afford, and this is what motivates him. Anyway, he has an agenda. So let's take a look at this very clip of the finale from Rent and consider what is the filmmaker's agenda based on the film and the song that the group sings. In other words, what's important to him in life, and what's he willing to do to carry that out?
There is no future, there is no past. Thank God this moment's not the last. There's only us, there's only this. Forget, regret, or life is yours to miss. No
So in the case of the filmmaker, his agenda was documenting life. Now that's a pretty broad way of thinking of it. That's what photographers do, that's what filmmakers do. But more importantly, he was documenting the relationship of his friends and the lives of his friends, because that was what was important to him. And that was his short-term agenda and probably his long-term artistic agenda as well. And we see, as he's projecting that small, brief film that he compiles from all the excerpts that he's collected throughout all the time of life from that movie. Quite an interesting thing. When we're thinking about artistic agenda, there are really three things that we need to make distinctions between. One is artistic goals, one is artistic process, and the other one is artistic agenda. Artistic goals are the work and the desire of creating a body of works that leads to a body of works. Plays, manuscripts, photographs, paintings, works of sculpture, dances. This body of works that an artist amasses over their career is related to their goals. They say, I will create certain works within a certain framework and do it in this way over a period of time. Those are the actual goals. They can be very general or they can be very specific. But it is a little different than an artistic agenda. The artistic process are the things that artists go through in order to create the work that they are involved in. And third, artistic agenda is specifically the formal, overall decision-making process that an artist goes through in order to create the work. It uses goals, but the artistic agenda is again the true north. Is this going to be my life work or the work for this next season? Yes or no? It's based on their motivations and what they want to achieve. But agenda can be connected to social issues. Agenda can be connected to many things. Whereas goals simply focus mostly on creating specific body of works. I'm going to write a play. I'm going to paint a painting. Artistic agenda puts it into a much larger context. And again, like a compass, it can help an artist find true north in times of difficulty. So here's some motivations in setting the agenda. The personal experience and desire to grow on part of the artist. There can be political context to the work. There could be political motivations. There can be social motivations in setting the agenda. There can also be religious or creative motivations. All of these motivations help shape or form the agenda. Mature artists typically have gotten to the point where they are in their career because they have an agenda. Some of them actually go through a process of introspection and writing things down and mapping things out for their lives. Some of them do it much more informally. But regardless, the mature artist that has stayed the course over his or her career is one that has an agenda, that has broader connections. And these connections are these motivations that you see in front of you. The experience and desire to grow, political, social, religious, or creative motivations. In other words, when I get up in the morning, creatively speaking, I can't think of anything I'd rather do but to create this artwork. So let's look at some of these motivations in setting the agenda. Let's look at personal experience and desire to grow. This is an excerpt from a book that was actually a collection of letters that went back and forth between a young aspiring poet who was in the military and an older established poet at the time, Rilke. And again, if you've never had the opportunity to read Letters to a Young Poet, there are numerous English translations of it, and it's a wonderful book. I would encourage you to go find it because it really does encapsulate this struggle of this young military officer who wants to become a writer and become a poet. And so he writes to the contemporary poet of the day, Rilke, and asks for advice. And Rilke responds. And this book is a collection of the letters that went back and forth at that time. But here's what Rilke says about personal experience and desire to grow. We must embrace struggle. Every living thing conforms to it. Everything in nature grows and struggles in its own way, establishing its own identity, insisting on it at all cost against all resistance. This was from the 7th letter that Rilke sent to Capus in Rome in 1904. Through that time period where they corresponded, Rilke moved between certain European cities, and so we know what cities the letters were sent to. Kappas always knew how to get the letters to Rilke, and Rilke always knew how to get the letters' responses back to Kappas. There's the creative motivation. In other words, when I wake up in the morning, what would I do first and foremost if I had the opportunity? So again, this is from Letters to a Young Poet. And this is actually from the first letter, the first response that was sent from Paris in 1903. This is what Rilke said. Above all, in this most silent hour of your night, ask yourself this: must I write? Dig deep into yourself for a true answer, and if it should ring its assent, if you confidently meet this serious question with a simple "I must," then build your life upon it. It has become your necessity. There's an American composer who was asked one time, why do you write music? And his response is, I don't hear anyone else writing what I'm hearing in my mind. And that's true. And this particular composer had an urge and an urgency and a need, a necessity to get this out and to make this music public in some way, shape, or form. So again, it has become your necessity. As well as motivation, artists need to have a means to achieve the agenda. Sometimes that's material means, like time, physical materials to create the artwork. Sometimes it's an attitude. There's an interesting book that John Maxwell wrote in 2007 called Talent is Never Enough, in which he talks about some older historic examples of artists and people who are creative in different endeavors. And he talks about contemporary examples as well. And he came up with an observation called what he calls the talent plus formula. Because so often he observed that we observe the talent of artists and we don't always understand why they don't achieve the next level. And sometimes it's because there's other stuff in their lives and in their professional practices that don't meet up to standards, and because of that, they don't rise to the next level. So this is the talent plus formula. He says the other things include belief, passion, initiative, focus, preparation, practice, perseverance, courage, teachability, character, relationships, responsibility, and teamwork. In his book, he discusses all these matters, and he gives excellent examples. Again, some are historic examples from the arts, some are from sports, some are from politics. But again, it's the matter of these other things help to determine the path that an artist or a person is on. And it's a way of creating a means for the artist. But again, talent is never enough. And we can think of examples in contemporary society of artists who are rising stars, but then they crash and burn because they don't have the second part. They don't have the passion, or they don't have the focus. They have the talent, but they don't have the second part, which is the means to achieve it. Practices of artists are very important. Without regular practices, artists will flounder. An artist can be talented, an artist has the ability to create all kinds of work, but if they don't work in a very systematic or regular method, eventually their work will go by the wayside. They will never realize the potential. And this is the point where artists are able to interface with society in very positive ways, because if they have strong working practices, this helps them out a great deal. One practice that artists in all disciplines have who are successful are sketching practices. We're going to look at 3 examples very briefly. We're going to look at Beethoven, Da Vinci, and a writer named Natalie Goldberg. In the case of Da Vinci, he used sketching as a means of observing the world around him. Those observations then became part of his great masterpieces. In the case of Natalie Goldberg, she advocates very strongly for keeping notebooks and writing things down as quickly as possible, just capturing ideas that can be developed later. Or perhaps it could even be just a very brief short story that comes to mind without having to write the magnum opus, the great, magnificent, extended work that's going to be the end-all, be-all of all works. She says you need to write down the bones. So sketching is capturing. For Da Vinci, observing is capturing. With Beethoven, his notebooks and his sketchbooks took on a little bit different air. But again, he sketched. He would write down basic ideas, and then he would have the entire rest of the music manuscript paper to be able to write ways to manipulate and have the idea evolve. It's very interesting. The very famous musical idea from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the little four-note motive that occurs throughout that first movement, it started off as a very basic idea on the start of a sketchbook on a particular page. By the time he had worked out all the manipulations and manifestations of it, he got back down at the bottom of that page. He eventually came back to the initial idea, and he realized he had come full circle. But it's a way of working out ideas. So again, sketching, observing, capturing, and working out ideas. Three very important parts of the sketching practice. Here's a page from one of Leonardo da Vinci's famous notebooks. Here it's an anatomical study where he is studying the bones of different arms, different types of arms. He's also writing in Italian comments about this. And this is again part of sketching, observing. He was a keen observer of nature. He wanted to know how this all worked. And then everything that he did in this line eventually found its ways into his paintings, into his frescoes, murals. It's why Leonardo da Vinci was able to be one of the top 1% of all artists of all times, because he used sketching as a means of observing and recording ideas. Again, part of the sketching practice, which is actually capturing in this case, we have Natalie Goldberg. In 1986, she wrote down a book, Writing Down the Bones, which is very popular with many writers, in which she advocates very strongly for capturing that very brief moment. If it's just a mood, an attitude, an idea, whatever it is, write it down right then. You always have time to later develop it into a full chapter of a book. You always have time to do other things with it. But sketching for a writer is capturing essence of life. She has written many different types and genres of work. But on the right-hand side of the page, you see a cover from a book, another book she wrote, The Practice of Writing Memoirs, Old Friend from Far Away. And again, it's this idea of capturing, which becomes the essence of storytelling, which becomes great literature eventually. Using sketching as a means of working out ideas was something that Beethoven did all the time. Here is a fragment from one of his compositions. It's a very, very messy sketch, I must say. It's difficult to read the exact notes that he wants. You can barely make out the precise pitches in some cases. In some cases, he's just given us the rhythm of something, and he's written in some letters. For example, his quill crow pen splotched a little bit. So if you look at that top line, you see the notes G, and then you see the notes H, which in German actually stands for the note B, E, and B flat. So it's kind of interesting because he has this little ascending bass line there that is that's worked its way in there, but it got all splotchy, so he had to write in the names of the notes, notes he recommended and what he was going to use. But again, it's a matter of working out ideas. I mentioned what happened with the very famous theme from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and one of his signature works. And again, it is all part of the spinning out of what goes on within the mind of an artist. But sketching is critical, and anyone who achieves great artistry has gone through a sketching process of some type as part of their artistic process. Journaling is a little bit like sketching, except it's using words or perhaps visual images to capture what's going on in one's lives. Sometimes people think of them as being diaries, but they don't always happen every day. And so therefore, they're usually referred to generally as journaling. There are a number of artists who kept journals or diaries of their life, and it gives us insight when we look back at their lives and what they were doing and what they were going through. But more importantly, it provides the artist a way of sorting out what's happening around him or herself. There was a well-known American composer named Ned Rorem, and he kept diaries throughout his entire life and allowed him to reflect. And later on, he edited and published those diaries, and then musicians and music historians and audience members are able to get some insight into what was going on in his life when he was writing particular pieces of music. But again, the whole idea of journaling is to get it out of the mind and out of the heart and onto the page, so it helps us to improve in our lives. A man named Ira Progoff advocated journaling and created the intensive journal workshops He was born in 1921 and died in 1968. You can go online or you can go to a library and find out books about his life and the benefits that people had from journaling using this intensive journal workshop process. 3 very important things that he saw happening in people's lives and in the lives of artists and creative people around him. It helped them gain awareness of the diverse areas of your life, helps you connect with your real self, and develop a more meaningful life. In other words, what is important to you? Taking that idea of journaling one step farther and making it a little bit more contemporary, there is a writer named Julia Cameron who has written for numerous publications in the United States over her career. In 1992, she came out with a book called The Artist's Way. She was giving workshops on helping artists to become unblocked. Artists would have very personal or real physical or financial blocks, and she was giving a series of workshops to help artists find ways to overcome those blocks. She decided to write it into a book, and this book became very popular among artists and people in creative disciplines, and became somewhat of a household word in many creative writers' lives, and also in the lives of people in other disciplines as well. She continued and created a series of 2 more books and some other related spin-off works, because she is a prolific writer. But again, in The Artist's Way, at the central of this, she advocates journaling as a means of helping to achieve artistic agenda, helping to define it, helping to achieve it, and helping to further improve it and create a new agenda and a new life for your own artistic path. So with all these particular ways, again, artistic agenda is the compass, the true north for the artist. And if an artist has a clear artistic agenda, it does help the artist make choices in tough times, when times are thin, when opportunities aren't as abundant, or if multiple opportunities present themselves, which one is the one that's going to be pursued this week or this month or this year or this decade. Again, artistic agenda is important, and if we understand how artists think about their work as a whole, it helps us to get a better understanding of the relationship of the artist to society.